Welcome to Iraq Matters, podcasting from the Old Railway Depot in Swan Poodle, Washington, D.C.
Hey dear listeners, Shakumaku, this is Taif Jani.
And I'm Asha Othman.
Thank you for tuning in to Iraq Matters, an epic podcast that features news, ideas, and conversations about Iraq.
Before we begin with our program, here's a quick humanitarian update. Fighting in western and northern Iraq has forced 1.2 million people to flee their homes this year, and has left millions vulnerable in areas affected by violence. Seeking safety in Iraq's Kurdistan region and other areas across the country, this new wave of migration adds to the challenge of assisting a million or more Iraqis who remain displaced by previous years of violence, and other vulnerable populations, like the 212,000 registered Syrian refugees in Iraq.
That's right, Aisha. And also contributing to the crisis are reports of targeted killings and other abuses by the self-proclaimed Islamic State and other militant groups. Reports of human rights violations by the Iraqi security forces and militias, and reports of some Iraqis being prevented from reaching safer areas, including cases of discrimination against certain minority groups.
Here at EPIC, we are following these developments closely and working hard to encourage stronger U.S. engagement in Iraq and the Kurdistan region to address the crisis.
Special thanks to our supporters and to all of our colleagues here in the US, in Iraq, and across the world who are responding to the deepening humanitarian and human rights crisis in Iraq. So, Asha, would you like to tell our listeners who we have with us on this episode?
I'd be happy to. This week's episode features a special interview with Sarhang Hamasaeed from the U.S. Institute of Peace for discussion on civil society, social groups, politics, and more.
We believe that it's important not to forget about civil society leaders and the organizations that support them, and shine a light on the important role they play in countering all the violence and improving the security situation in conflict regions. In Iraq in particular, civil society is essential not only because it pushes the government to be more accountable, but also because it helps addressing critical gaps where the government is just absent.
So, stay tuned for an intriguing perspective on Iraq's recent past and future.
Hi dear listeners, this is Taif Jani, and I'm really pleased today to have this episode with a phenomenal guest, Mr. Sarhang Hamasaeed. So let's start with an introduction. Would you like to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Well, thank you for having me. My name is Sarhang Hamasaeed. I'm a senior program officer for the U.S. Institute of Peace. I work on the Middle East and North Africa program, and I lead the Iraq program here at USIP.
Awesome. Let's start the conversation with civil society and its importance in Iraq. How has the surge affected civil society organizations and their work in Iraq?
The security developments and the sense of relative calm that followed the surge allowed Iraqi civil society to engage with the community and play a larger role than they were able to do before, when the killings and the sectarian fighting was raging on. So it was a golden opportunity for them to establish themselves as a strong force and voice in Iraq, even political process.
Yeah.
In 2010, it was Iraqi civil society, a coalition of Iraqi civil society, who filed a suit in the federal court against the government and the parliament that they need to abide by the constitutional timeline and form the government, because as you may recall, the government formation process lasted 10 months, and civil society was a strong, active voice there, but also on the street level, restoring community peace and being a voice for moderation is one of the success stories of Iraq after the 2003 war.
Amazing. So can you tell us a little bit kind of in details about civil society organizations working, for example, if we start with Basra, a place where people don't really hear about that much?
Yeah, so civil society, for example, in Basra, plays an active role in different areas on bridging the relationship between the community and the security forces. For example, in Iraq, for decades, the police was a repressive tool in the hand of the government. So the civil society over there have been trying to bridge the relationship on both sides to identify issues of common interest between both sides. So today, when Iraq is struggling with the high level of violence from the Islamic State, the security forces are under huge stress. And we've seen many militias go out on the street and try to be a huge player in providing security. And civil society has worked with the Iraqi security forces to confront that phenomenon of having armed forces and not structured within the government on the street, to be the voice of the community. What are the concerns with that? And they have also been working on preventative measures. Instead of the community in the past wouldn't know where the threat would come from. But with the civil society connecting the community and the police with each other, they are collaborating on how to prevent the escalation of violence reaching their communities, collaborating on, as they receive displaced people from other parts of Iraq, how to help them and not let that become a source of security concern.
Sure. And it seems like with the conflict, there are different characters playing with it. So, for example, there are militias, there's the IS group, and there's also the government's response to their, like in terms of airstrikes and bombings. So how do civil society programs work within these different groups and trying to kind of work with the people to prevent violence?
Civil society, well before the violence breaks out to the current level, have been trying to prevent this actually from escalating, to work on advocate to solve the grievances of the communities. Today, as we see this massive level, it presents a significant challenge to civil society, because groups like the Islamic State, they do not work with the language of dialogue. They come in with force, they have their own ideology, and they impose their way of life and governing. So a good number of Iraqi civil society members have been displaced as a result of taking over land by the Islamic State. However, even though those displaced, while displaced, they are still trying to help their brethren with managing the humanitarian relief and accommodating the needs of the people. So they are now advocating for peaceful resolution to the problems of the Iraqi society, an inclusive government, and for the voice of nonviolence to prevail.
And are you aware of like what specific projects that they're working on? I mean, I myself, as an Iraqi, I was displaced back in 2006, and I know the difficulties of when you're in that situation. So for civil society individuals who are dedicated to improve the situation in Iraq, yet they are displaced themselves, what are like some of the difficulties they're facing? And if you know of like some specific project that some of them are working.
There is individual organization activities, and there is network of coalitions of civil society. So I've already told you about the example of Basra, where some of the USIP partners are working on addressing the security concerns, or the Alliance of Iraqi Minorities in Mosul, for example, where it faces the most hardships. They are working with Iraqi religious minorities to provide assistance to those displaced, but also to other non-minorities at the same time.
Yeah.
And on the political front, there is a coalition of 90 civil society organizations who've got together, and they are going around talking to the political parties, to the diplomatic missions in Baghdad, advocating for, first, nonviolent solution to the current crisis, second, getting assistance to address the humanitarian suffering, third, pushing the political process in Iraq to get on track and be the legitimate basis to resolving Iraq's problems.
So, briefly, why is civil society important in Iraq?
Civil society is important because they are the voice of the community. They are the civilian voice of the society that can function as a watchdog on the government to uphold its responsibilities and be accountable. But also they can be a collaborative partner with the government to address the problems of Iraq. Civil society also is a good partner for the international community when they want to go and help the Iraqi people. So at these difficult moments of Iraq, it is important for the international community to remain engaged with the Iraqi civil society, help them to confront the issues they face now and turn the page and help the country with the next chapter.
Let's shift focus to talk about youth. The Iraqi public is very young, and we as an organization, the Education for Peace in Iraq Center, focus on the youth of Iraq. So what role have youth played in countering the crisis?
You're exactly right. The youth are very important for Iraq's future and for Iraq today. They have been actually coveted by the different actors, whether you are trying to build peace or you are trying to get political gains. Everybody wants to have the youth on their side. And actually, Islamic State has been especially targeting the youth because they're tracking them through their ideology, through financial incentives and other means. And today, the Iraqi youth are under a lot of pressure from all directions. There are very nice initiatives on the Iraqi youth trying to confront the very forces that has been trying to tear the fabric of the Iraqi society. So they have been doing different activities in the form of singing for peace, in terms of being active on social media, spreading the message of peace. This is the month of Ramadan, going around and engaging with the families and showing solidarity among neighbors and families to show and spread those messages through Facebook. So these are some of the things that they do, helping in the campaigns to help the displaced people. But again, we have to remember that there's a limit to what they can do.
Sure.
With having large parts of the youth unemployed, this situation presents a huge challenge for them.
I mean, I definitely agree with you. And so why is investing in Iraqi youth critical to this situation?
If you are in your 20s in Iraq, you're living your youth when there's a lot of sectarianism around you, when there's a lot of violence around you. And that is not the right environment for you to grow and also to shape your personality. So it is very important for organizations, international organizations, to invest in youth, because it is these very people who could become assets for peace building or become the soldiers and the militia members. And coexistence for many of them, they have been confined to their neighborhoods or to their cities for a long time because of the violence. They did not have the opportunity to interact with other members of whether the same ethnic group or the same sectarian group. So USIP has invested, for example, in a program called Salam Shabab, where you bring the youth from different communities where they interact with each other for the first time. They learn about their differences and the cultural differences, but that doesn't mean that you cannot coexist. And through the specially designed curriculum for peace building and team building, they work together in sports activities and other intellectual competition, and they build relationships. And today, if you go to the website salamshabab.com, you will see that those very youth are spreading the message of peace, because if these platforms are not provided for the youth to get together and interact and form these relationships, I'm afraid the reality of the situation has imposed such a kind of situation that they cannot connect with each other on their own.
I definitely believe in the Iraqi youth, and hopefully at some point in the future we can have a more peaceful coexistence among all of us from all different backgrounds. I mean, there's a lot of violations of human rights happening in Iraq right now, unfortunately, one of which is women's rights. So can you tell us a little bit about what have you heard so far in terms of what women are facing in Iraq?
The situation in Iraq is particularly difficult for women because they are a mother and a member of the Iraqi society. So they are affected by the developments and the way it affects everybody, but also as a mother who loses her son, who loses members of family when displaced and go through hardship. She's particularly challenged because there are families who have just divided up as they had to run away from the violence. Their different members of the family had to go in different directions. In the areas where they are displaced, it does not have the kind of services that is suitable for women's needs, and violations happen in terms of harassment. And there are unconfirmed stories about how there has been cases of rape. So they are extremely vulnerable at these times of violence in Iraq.
Are you aware of any initiatives or organizations that are focusing kind of on that particular problem?
I mean, women are of particular focus for civil society organizations in Iraq. So as they go and address the needs of the IDPs. They try to emphasize the needs of the women, but the magnitude of the humanitarian suffering is so great. I don't think the international community and the organizations on the ground have been able to adequately address this particular need.
So what role do women play in countering this terrorism and violence?
The women are almost always the voice of moderation in the time of conflict because, again, as I said, it's them who are affected the most by getting the pressure of the security situation, being very vulnerable, losing their dear ones. So they take the brunt, but that's why they always try to be a voice of moderation, to work with other women, to engage with their family members, to not go in the route of violence. And actually, a good number of Iraqi civil society organizations have women in their leadership, either at the helm of the organization or being project managers. So they are definitely strong advocates out there.
And then another group that's been targeted for years, or groups actually, are the minorities in Iraq. I'm from the Mandaean community, and for years, different minorities have been facing lots of discrimination. What are some of the challenges the minorities are facing in Iraq right now? I know USIP has been working closely with minorities in Iraq, so can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. The minorities have found themselves in Iraq under attack from the jihadists because they target them for their religion, but they also have been a victim of the larger tensions and conflicts between the larger components of Iraqi society. So in terms of representation, they don't have the numbers of votes to be a strong player in the politics of the country. They don't have the militias that would protect them. So they have been targeted, and they have seen their numbers go down significantly over the years. USIP has worked with the different minority groups, especially the religious minority groups, including the Christians, the Yazidis, the Sabian Mandaeans, and the Shabak, through providing them tools for them to organize themselves and advocate for their rights. And actually, if you look at the political landscape of Iraq, if you really zoom in on what the Alliance of Iraqi Minorities have accomplished, you will be amazed about why not more of that has been done. For example, they have lobbied the Iraqi parliament, and they have introduced change to the budget law in 2012 that basically stipulate the distribution of the budget should happen on a population basis within the provinces. Before, it was done at the provincial level. Now, this new change to the law allows them to, on a district basis, they can go, if the minority districts can go to the provincial government and say, look, we have the legal ground now, we need our fair share of the budget to come to our districts. And they advocated for that, and they made sure that those are translated into projects, schools, roads, health clinics, and other types of projects. They have also worked with the Ministry of Education to introduce change into the curriculum where the minorities, for the first time in Iraq's history, are recognized in the textbooks, and gradually their literature and the text from their holy book introduced into the curriculum. Obviously, these are gains that are not highlighted as the larger problems of Iraq more in the news.
Yeah.
But if we look at the methodology and the way that the minorities have worked, it could provide lessons for how addressing other grievances of Iraqi society through the legal framing, through hard work, through organized work, through coming together. But right now, the reality is, on the ground, a significant number of them live in Mosul, and their situation is really dire.
Yeah, it is. I mean, having to live, for example, during the Civil War time in Iraq between 2005 and up to 2008, I mean, the situation for me, at least, has been always very difficult living, kind of always been pushed and marginalized on this side. But there's also a sense that these minorities say, no, we're going to stick around, because if we leave, if everyone leaves, then that's it. And these are historical groups who've been in that area for a long time. So do you think, for example, there should be some efforts to preserve the cultural significance that some of these minorities offer to the Iraqi situation?
I totally agree that Iraq has the richness of so many different communities and religions and ethnicities that have coexisted in Iraq for a long time. And the kind of situation that we see that threatens their very existence in the country is very unfortunate. So I think they do deserve the attention of the Iraqi government and the international community to help them through these difficult times. And there are conflicting views on this. So a good number of the minorities have been leaving Iraq for good because they feel that they cannot feel protected and safe over there. And you have others in the minorities, they blame the international community for facilitating their escape. So there's a dilemma for the international community, how to help. There is a limit to what they can do to help them, protect them on the ground, but also they're leaving the country has the risk of losing that diversity of the Iraqi society.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about politics. Now, ISIS is not new in Iraq, but unfortunately, media hasn't done justice in covering what's happening in Iraq. Because ISIS, for example, when they came to Anbar earlier this year, they received very little acknowledgement in the media. So can you tell us a little bit of what you know about what's happening in Fallujah and what are some of the developments?
The Islamic State, this militant group, has been active in Iraq even well before Fallujah. They have been extorting millions of dollars a month from the Iraqi population in Mosul and Salahuddin and Anbar. And they have been fighting the Iraqi army and the Iraqi security forces even before the U.S. troop withdrawal. However, by the time the U.S. troop withdrawal, they were contained and they were on the run. But as the conflict in Syria continued, it attracted fighters and resources from around the world. The Islamic State has grown stronger and has shifted its resources back to Iraq. And they exploited the grievances of disaffected communities in Iraq who they found themselves the space and the sympathizers to support their fight. The international community did not pay attention while this was happening because for many people, Iraq was a done deal and they felt that this is more of an Iraqi fight and they should do it on their own. However, as we have seen in the recent weeks, this challenge is greater than the capability of the Iraqi security forces to deal with it. The sources of the problem stem from political problems in Iraq that the Iraqis have not been able to resolve on their own. And as we have seen now, they've turned Iraq and Syria into one stage of operation. They are threatening stability of other countries in the region, like Lebanon and Jordan. And so if the international community does not help the Iraqis and the Syrians to address this problem, it could pose threat well beyond what Iraq turn into the self-proclaimed caliphate and state they established could become a base of operation for exporting terrorism to other countries. We hear that there are many Westerners with Western passports who are fighting along the lines of the Islamic State. Those people could come back and pose a threat to the countries that they come from. There are reports about some 55 to 60 nationalities represented in the ranks of the Islamic State. That's almost 1/3 of the countries membered in the United Nations. So that it's important for the international community to take this seriously, because should this Islamic State hold territory, it could attract further fighters from around the world. And they have declared that this is not an Iraqi land or a Syrian land. This is an Islamic land. So everybody is welcome. So that could open the floodgate for a lot of others to go there. And the nature of the problem will transform in ways that whatever tools available to us to deal with the problem today may not be available tomorrow.
So how can the international community, example, help in this situation? What can they do?
Well, there are certain elements of that help. First of all, recognizing that this is not only an Iraqi issue, the nature of the threat is a regional one. Second, therefore, it takes a regional effort to come together because there are competing interests for regional powers, and they have had their own proxy war in Iraq. I think the Islamic State and the threat that they pose could become a unifying factor for coordinating efforts to confront this problem. And third, to recognize that the Islamic State flourished and expanded at the margin of political problems and the weak state, non-inclusive state, and that needs to be addressed. And fourth, it is very important to immediately and as much as possible provide resources and expertise to host communities that have refugees and internally displaced people to deal with this problem. From the 2006-2007 violence of Iraq, there are still about 1 million people who have never returned home. From the recent violence, there's about 1.2 million people. So you have 2.2 million people, just Iraqi refugees or displaced people. And you have a greater number of Syrian refugees. You have populations that have shifted. And these will become tomorrow's problem. It is important to deal with these problems today. Otherwise, the options for tomorrow will be far more complicated and the costs will be greater.
But there are also, I realize that the international community must do more, but at the same time, the Iraqi leaders and politicians, there's some work on their side that needs to be done. So what is, for example, the mindset or actions that the Iraqi leaders need to take in addressing this crisis?
The Iraqi leaders, they represent the concerns of their communities. For example, there's a lot of mistrust among the Iraqi communities and the Iraqi leaders that stem from Iraq's history of one community being the ruler and the others being repressed. So you have that. And second, these communities have not worked together so the experience of elections and working with each other is new to Iraq. Transforming from decades of dictatorship and command and control to inclusive government takes time. So that the culture, it takes time to transform the culture for these leaders to work together. The United States and the international community could help continue playing a mediating role between the different factions of Iraq to reach an agreement. And that agreement has two issues that needs to take into consideration, learning from the experience of the past. One is that certain solutions were not realistic, where they did not factor what those communities wanted. Those agreements were accepted under pressure. So taking a hard look about what these communities accept and what solutions they would be willing to work with, not imposed on them, is important to look at. And the Iraqi constitution has the flexibility that can accommodate those solutions. Second, upholding promises that are made. In 2010, there was an agreement that was accepted by the different parties. But a lot of the Iraqi leaders would tell you that agreement was not respected, especially by Prime Minister Maliki. So the international community will have to work with the Iraqi leaders to put in measures that are acceptable and that they can trust, and also remain engaged until where these agreements go off track, they provide their input and try to bring it back on.
Should Iraq's diverse community be considered as an asset to this crisis rather than a hindrance?
In principle, yes, it should be. The reality is that Iraqi society is diverse. You have communities from different backgrounds, and so they have the right to that land, they have the right to a peaceful coexistence. So whatever you have in Iraq should respect that diversity. But unfortunately, the voice of violence, the voice of unilateralism sometimes speaks louder than the voices that seek to respect and work with that diversity.
And lately, kind of among the same subject, there's been a lot of talk about Iraq disintegrating, and we're hearing this word all over. Do you think that's actually a reality that is facing Iraq?
The threat exists and it's real. But is it inevitable? That is in the hand of the Iraqi people and the international community, or the Iraqi leaders, I should say. Because if they continue on the path of not working with each other and not accommodating the interests of the different communities, you are already on a path of clashing, and that could only escalate. So that could be avoided if they change the way the different communities are represented, their concerns are addressed, and the government formation process could provide an avenue for that. When the Iraqi people went to vote on April 30th this year, they had a lot of hopes this election will be an opportunity for change and it will break the political gridlock in the country. But they have been disappointed by the fact that violence has increased and the government formation has been slow. It took pressure from the United States and the Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani and others to put pressure to form this government. So the Iraqi leaders have a historic responsibility to come together. If they don't, then I'm afraid not only a breakup, but a violent breakup may be on the way, and that's going to be a disaster.
With the government formation right now, what are some of the challenges they are facing along with the crisis and the threat that IS is posing?
Yeah, the challenge is, again, so you have parties and leaders who have worked with each other and know each other and there is personal and political differences that has basically created a toxic environment where they cannot reach agreement. And so they have now elected the Speaker of the House. You have the President and the Prime Minister. And the President may be an easier choice, but choosing the Prime Minister is the most contentious issue of all, and that has to be seen. They disagree on nominating or having the Prime Minister Maliki for a third term. He insists on staying on for a third term. It is unclear yet what is the outcome of that disagreement, but it is important to remember not to only focus on the mechanics of the process. Appointing these people in themselves does not end the problem. Yes, it saves the legitimacy of the political process in Iraq, and you will have a legitimate framework to work with, but the disagreements will remain there. So much rests on the elected leaders to see if they can find a workable path for taking the country out of the current crisis.
Absolutely. To you personally, what does this crisis mean? For me, as someone who was born and raised in Iraq, I'm really disappointed to see what's happening in Iraq again. When I left, I was hoping that I would come back to Iraq for a brighter future. And I think Iraqis were feeling like that, like in the past couple of years, they were seeing some hope. But unfortunately, this happens. So what does it really mean to you?
And wherever you see violence and loss of life, it's tragic. And it is particularly concerning in Iraq because, and other countries in the region where I work with, there are people who are partners that I work with on a daily basis, that their lives are affected. I'm originally from the region, and I'm originally from Iraq, so it is also personal for me where I have family and friends that I'm concerned for. So to see people displaced, to see their livelihoods significantly affected by the violence is very unfortunate. And I hope through the collective wisdom and work of all of us could find a way to mitigate current crisis and help the country, people of Iraq and the wider region to be on a more peaceful path.
Yeah, I really hope so. So in conclusion, can you tell us a little bit about how USIP is responding to the crisis?
USIP has been working in Iraq since 2003, and we maintain an office there in Baghdad since 2004. So we've been investing in peace building since then. We've trained conflict resolution facilitators and organizations that work on that. We have been working with them, as I said, to bridge the relationship between the security and the community, to prevent violence. We've been working with the minorities to make sure that they are represented and they work together. We are working with Iraqi civil society and the local governments to use technology to bring in efficiencies that address the performance of the government that had resulted in lack of services that has been one of the drivers of the tensions in Iraq. So we are also working with the people we've trained in facilitation to support reconciliation in the country. Actually, I was in Iraq 3 or 4 days before the events of Mosul started. We were discussing with our Iraqi partners how can we work with the political leaders, the religious leaders, and the tribal leaders to find common ground that could be used as a basis for reconciliation. We are still in touch with our partners. We had to make sure that our staff and partners are safe, and now the situation is still unfolding. So there is a limit to what you can do in a very active, violent environment. So we are still trying to find steps to support reconciliation and prevent the other communities to be affected. As I mentioned in Basra or in other places when they receive IDPs, the nature of the security changes. We are also here in Washington convening discussion groups, and we are trying to inform the thinking here through the media, through private meetings on the Hill, the State Department, to see how can we support Iraqi civil society and the Iraqis to confront this challenge.
We love to ask our guests, why does Iraq matter?
Iraq matters because suffering anywhere, I think, should be the concern for everyone. Second, Iraq matters because there's a lot of violence and loss of life that need to be stopped. If this violence is not stopped, it could escalate, it could get further, and it could engulf other countries of the region who are allies and friends of the United States and other countries. So there is an interest in that direction as well. So the intervention that you could do now will be far easier and simpler compared to what you can do 2-3 years ago. Look at the example of Syria. The international community is now at paralysis because everybody said we should have acted earlier when it was possible to act. Today, the nature of the conflict is so complicated, the international community feels that it doesn't have the options. And it is important because if the violence and the organization like the Islamic State continues and expands its operations, it will be a threat not only for Iraq and the Iraqi people or the region, but also to the international community.
Absolutely.
And that violence not only brings you violence, but also it will be a destabilizing factor for the global economy. I know the U.S. economy has diversified. It's not reliant on the oil and energy from the Middle East, but the global economy is. The partners and friends of the United States are. So there is also an interest in that lane as well.
Right. And it's definitely critical that it's not only about solving the problem right now, but also investing and creating a long-term strategy and plan that will assist Iraq in the future kind of to stand on its feet.
I totally agree, because if you do not invest in sustainable mechanisms that address the problems that got us into the situation that we have today, it could be another chapter that we'll come back to it again. So whatever you do today, you have to have an eye on the future. How do you make this solution sustainable?
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Sarhang, for joining Iraq Matters.
Thank you for having me.
On behalf of EPIC, special thanks to Sarhang for joining us on Iraq Matters.
Be sure to join us again next week for another exciting episode. We'll be talking with our colleague Christine Vandentoorn, an American researcher based in Iraq since 2009. She has been closely following the crisis unfolding in Mosul and the surrounding Nineveh plains. What's been the impact on the area's rich cultural heritage and diversity? How is it affecting societal relations? And what steps are locals taking to stay safe under the shadow of militant groups? That's all coming up next week on Iraq Matters.
Now, we'd like to hear from you. Visit us online and share your feedback, questions, and story ideas. Make sure to also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
We also encourage you to subscribe to our iTunes and Stitcher channels, where you can get the newest episodes of Iraq Matters, and share us with a friend.
This is Taif,
And Asha,
reminding you that
Iraq matters.